Welcome to the Industrial Commissioning Association podcast. My name is Paul Turner, and in today's episode, we're going to discuss commissioning as risk mitigation for your projects. Now, you often hear the commissioning folks talking about early involvement of commissioning, that they want to be involved earlier in the projects to help plan and execute the commissioning activities that come later. But then on the opposite side, we often hear from project leaders that they don't believe there's any value in involving commissioning earlier in the project. And there's a disconnect between these two groups, and I think it's because there's still confusion between testing and commissioning. So you of course don't need testing early in the project. There's nothing to test when you're preparing contracts and when you're working on your feed processes. You certainly don't need your team of 30 or 50 or whatever team that's going to be doing the testing in the field. That wouldn't make sense. And I think that might be the confusion, what project leaders are thinking is being asked of, that we need to bring these testing folks earlier on the project, which isn't the case. But we do need to have that one single commissioning project manager role involved earlier in the project during procurement processes as risk mitigation during our feed processes. That commissioning project manager role is the role to identify issues earlier in your project to save time and money for what would be issues that are much more expensive to address later in the project. And this is why you hear the commissioning folks saying that commissioning needs to be involved earlier in projects, not for the testing role, but definitely for the commissioning project management role. Think about the two extremes of when a particular issue could be addressed. An issue could be addressed during feed processes or addressed earlier in contracts before they're even signed. Or on the other extreme, an issue could be addressed post-project in court during litigation. Those are the two extreme ends of when an issue on a project could be addressed, right? So at which point is it going to be less expensive to resolve that issue when you think about these two extremes? And I think you can agree that the court process, the litigation process, gets quite expensive to address that issue. It would be much cheaper, faster, and easier to address that particular issue very early in the project at the other extreme of when contracts are being written and when your feed processes are being performed. So of course there's a whole time frame here when issues could be addressed, but when you think about those two extremes, it makes a lot more sense to address issues earlier in your project because it's going to be a lot more expensive later in your project to address issues. And this is the reason to engage your commissioning project manager earlier in your project during your feed processes, is to help identify these issues earlier so that they can be addressed and they're a lot cheaper to fix rather than finding issues later in the project when they're much more expensive to fix. Having your certified CxPM involved much earlier in your project is going to help you when you're preparing contracts to include a prioritized construction sequence in your construction contracts that must align with your commissioning and startup sequence to achieve your project and service date. So this input from experienced commissioning project managers is required to help align your construction and commissioning activities when contracts are first being written. Your certified CxPM is also going to help you define details in your construction contracts of what's needed from construction in order to achieve successful commissioning and startup at the end of your project. And without these defined in contracts before they are signed, it is much more difficult to negotiate these things later after contracts are already awarded. Another important role of your experienced commissioning project manager is to bring the lessons learned from commissioning and startup and operation of the facilities back to the beginning of your projects during your feed processes. Most projects are great at gathering lessons learned, but a lot of projects are terrible at applying lessons learned to the next projects. So this is how that is done, is engaging the folks at the end of the project, your commissioning and operations folks, to participate at the beginning of your project during feed processes to be able to apply these lessons learned rather than just document them and file your document away and forget about your lessons learned. This is the method to apply those lessons learned, is by engaging the folks at the end of your project back at the beginning of your project. And that critical role to involve for commissioning is your commissioning project manager. Another key reason to involve your CxPM early in your project is they will systematize your project for you during your feed processes. And this defines the specific details of what's required for construction deliverables to align with commissioning and startup. When you systematize your project early, this forms the backbone of all activities on your project to guide design deliverables and guide when construction deliverables are required in order to exactly align with your commissioning and startup sequence to achieve your project in service date. When systematization happens much later in the project, that's when you end up with misaligned construction activities that aren't in the right sequence to align with commissioning and startup. Everything becomes a jumbled mess at the end. When you systematize your project early, this is also used as the structure to define your commissioning software, which needs to be set up earlier in your project as well to manage your gated completions and your gated commissioning process through that complex transition from construction to commissioning. When this happens too late in the project, then this transition becomes very unorganized, unsequenced, and potentially dangerous when it creates a lot of safety hazards because it's not structured in an organized manner, being planned too late in the project. Your CxPM is your best source to plan for commissioning and identify issues early. Having a CxPM early on your project is really like having a crystal ball. They can see the future because they know how the project needs to end because that's their role. And they can help you avoid issues that are much more expensive to fix later in the project if they're not addressed earlier during FEED and during construction. The best method to mitigate risk on your project is to engage your certified CxPM as early as possible, and they will easily save you 10x or even 100x more than their salary by identifying issues earlier that it would have cost millions of dollars to fix later in your project. And your monthly risk register isn't really much help to manage risk on your project if you're not taking action on each item that's listed in the register. What you really need is active risk mitigation on a daily basis, on an hour-by-hour basis, and by engaging your CxPM earlier in your project, that's what they're going to help with, is risk management by the hour to ensure the end of your project is successful. Having your CxPM engaged on your project as early as possible is your best source of risk mitigation to make sure not only the beginning of your project is successful, but the end is successful as well. If you'd like to learn more, visit our website at icxa.net, and I'll see you in the next episode.